In our last video, we looked at arrays, and we saw that arrays could be used to group multiple variables together. We could store multiple things in an array. We could add and remove from the array. We could reverse the array. We could do a lot of useful things with arrays. But we saw that when we started to deal with ranges, arrays weren't working the way we want them to. Things were kind of difficult with arrays because we had to kind of take this obtuse, difficult, challenging, tedious approach to writing our functions. So if we look at this function that we wrote in our last module, you can see that, this sequence of if statements, it's kind of repetitive. We're doing the same thing over and over again. And all we're really doing is just we're adding 1 to the values that we're looking at here. And it's not very easy to read, and it's not very efficient. So kind of tedious to write the code for it, kind of tedious to look at the code for it, and also it only works on up to 4 values. If we passed in a range that had 50 values, we wouldn't actually be able to do this unless we copied and pasted this code 50 times. That's not going to be a great way to do things. So the only way we've really had to do any repetition is just this copy plus paste plus paste plus paste plus paste, which is not good. So if you think about what might end up happening there, let's say we did write that code so that it would work on up to 50 different values. We'd copy and paste and paste and paste and paste, and we'd have this really tedious challenge of pasting code over and over again. But let's say we pasted it 50 times and then we saw that we had an error. Well, now we have to go back and we have to fix that error 50 times. So that's not a great situation for us to be in. It's going to be a lot of work, and we can find and replace things, but that's not always a great way to do it either. So this isn't a great solution. Fortunately, we have while loops. While loops allow you to repeat some set of statements as long as this condition is met. So if we look at this code on the left side, we're going to declare a counter variable and set it equal to 0. And then we're going to say while counter is less than 10, perform these statements, log counter, and then set counter equal to counter plus 1. This loop is going to just keep running and running and running until counter is no longer less than 10. So we can think about how this might run. Well, we're going to start off with counter equal to 0, and we're going to check to see if counter is less than 10. It is, so we're going to log it, and then we're going to add 1 to that value. So what we'll end up with here is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but not 10, because once we get to 10, once we execute that statement, counter is equal to counter plus 1, that's going to increase counter all the way up to 10, well then while counter less than 10 is not going to be true anymore. So we're not going to run that statement, and we're just going to continue on to the rest of our code. This actually allows us to kind of perform like an if-else statement, in that while is only going to run code if that condition is true. So if we started off with counter equal to 1,000, we wouldn't run any of these statements. We wouldn't run logger.log counter. We wouldn't set any or change counter at all. We just skip the while loop entirely. So that gives us the ability to perform operations, but also to kind of check to see if these operations should continue to be performed. So a while loop allows us to perform multiple statements repetitively and really avoid the need to have to write this code in a copy-paste fashion. Now, adding something to a variable, it's so common that we actually have many ways to do it. And this works in pretty much every C-style language that I know. JavaScript, Java, C, C++, AppScript, they all kind of have this same kind of notation. And if you look at the code on the right where we have I is equal to I plus 1, that's exactly the same as saying I plus equals 1 or I plus plus. Every one of these just sets I equal to I plus 1. And these are just nice shorthands to have because it's so common to add 1 to a variable that we just like to do it easily. In fact, we even have a name for it. It's called incrementing the value. So we have I is equal to I plus 1. We could use I plus equals 10. It doesn't have to be 1 there. I plus equals -5. Any of those would work, but what that does is it says I is equal to I plus whatever that value is. In this case, we're just looking at 1. And then I plus plus just adds 1 to I. We don't need to introduce an 1 or anything. It just works. Now, we can also subtract this way. In fact, with this I minus equals 1, we can use I times equals 1. We can use I divided equals 1. And each one of those is going to work in the same way for that operation. But each one of these statements is going to subtract 1 from I. So I equals I minus 1, I minus equals 1, and I minus minus. They all just subtract 1 from I, and we call that decrementing. So we do a lot of incrementing and decrementing variables in pretty much any programming language. The while loop, we can change this so that we have less code, and we just use this increment operator. So this plus plus, we call that the increment operator. on the left, you'll see that we're iterating from 0 up to 10, and we're setting counter equal to counter plus 1. On the right, it's the exact same thing. We're just saying counter plus plus to eliminate some code that we have to write and to make things a little bit cleaner. We also have a do while loop. So the while loop, what it did was it evaluated before it ran anything. So if we had while counter is less than 10 and counter isn't less than 10 before when it starts, well, that while loop will never run a single time. A do while loop, however, runs at least one time. So this do while, it will do and perform the operations, and then it checks if it should repeat at the end. So if you think about this, do sum plus equals x while sum is less than 100, it's basically going to add x to sum, but if sum was already 1000 and x was 12, well, then sum would be 1012. If this were a normal while loop, if this were while sum is less than 100, sum plus equals x, we'd actually just have sum as 1000. So this do while always checks at the end, whereas a normal while loop always checks at the beginning. Now, if you start working with loops, you're going to run into a situation. Eventually everybody runs into an infinite loop. And basically what an infinite loop is it's a loop that we never get out of. The code just runs and runs and runs and runs and runs, and it never ever terminates. It just does the same thing over and over again. And if you look at this code, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen once you think about it for a second. Var counter is equal to 0. So counter is 0, while counter is less than 10, log counter. Well, we're never actually changing counter here. So what we'll end up with is a situation where we log 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and the machine's never going to stop doing that, which is bad. So this is going to be frustrating if you encounter it because it's not going to tell you there's an error. What you're going to end up with is a situation where it looks like your code just never stops running, and you're going to think, oh, I lost my internet connection or something's not quite right here. But eventually you might pick up on the fact that you did have an infinite loop, and it's just good to avoid these. Now, fortunately, we have for loops, and for loops help us to avoid infinite loops. So if you look at the code on the top where I have var I equals 0 while I is less than 10, and let's assume that this is code that's iterating through an array and logging what each array value is, and then we add 1 to I at the end, we can actually rewrite that using a for loop. So a for loop for var I equals 0 while I is less than 10, I plus plus, this we're going to log this statement, array index I is, and whatever that value is. So what happens with the for loop is we start off with that first thing, the var I equals 0, and we actually call that an initializer. Var I equals 0 is our initializer. Then we evaluate a condition before we run anything, and then we have an incrementer that executes at the end of our loop. So this is exactly the same as the while loop we had. If we start off with I equals 0, we run while I is less than 10, and then we put an I plus plus at the end of our loop, it works exactly the same way. So this for loop, actually, since we have to iterate so many times and we have to iterate a certain number of times, and we just use this so commonly, you actually see a lot of for loops in code. You see while loops as well, but for loops are very common. Typically, we might read this as for I from 0 to 10. And this, if you look at this, that kind of is what happens. For I from 0 to 10. And we're just going to add 1 to I each time, and what we'll end up with is array index I, so it'll be array index 0 is whatever is there, array index 1 is whatever is there, etc., etc., etc. In fact, we can even use, if we wanted to see more than the first 10 values, we could use array.length. Instead of I less than 10, we could use I is less than array.length, which would allow us to iterate up until the end of the array. Now that we've seen this, we can actually see exactly how this is going to make our life easier. As we saw in the last example, we can use loops to iterate through these arrays. So now that we've done this, we can actually make our code much more cleaner. This add for that we wrote in our last module, we can actually make that simpler. We can call this add all, and we still have the sum line. We still have var sum equals 0, and we're still checking to see if there's anything in the range. But now instead of using for if statements in sequence, checking the range and adding each number, now we can use this for loop. So we'll use for var I equals 0, and then up until I is less than range dot length, and then we'll add 1 to I each time. So this will actually allow us to add every value in a range together and return that sum. So much more efficient, much more clean, much easier to understand once you get what for loops are all about. So in the next few videos, we're going to get into for loops and while loops and see how we can use them in practice and see how we can actually do useful things with them. But for now, thank you for watching.